first of all, just want to say how excited that Dwayne and I are to have the opportunity to spend some time reflecting with everyone on what we've learned from what have been really excellent and substantive advisor and subject matter expert presentations over the last couple of months. Those presentations have laid a really solid foundation, we think, for the AAC's future activities, but leading up to the February facilitation and beyond, really. And what we hope to do today is provide a set of perspectives and considerations for future effort that will help everyone take this discussion about linked data and its potential back home with them, so that their conversations with their peers and management will be substantive in a way that helps this collective effort establish a really strong and convincing value proposition for everybody for the use of linked data within our institutions. And so to kick that off, just wanted to review a couple of our key takeaways from the previous presentations that we hope will set the stage for the rest of our conversation here today. We've gained a lot of confidence, I think, from these presentations, and in particular, we've come to understand that the foundation of any effort with linked data is obviously it's got to be built on a solid ontology, and cultural heritage is incredibly lucky to have just such a thing available to them in the form of the CDOC CRM. It's mature, it's extensible, it's been created specifically for use in the context of our domain. We're very lucky to have it. Next, we see that the supplementing technologies that support creation and management and publication of linked data are developing rapidly. We've seen them in the forms of data mapping tools like Karma, which we'll be using, a similar tool that was developed by Martin Dorr and Dominic Oldman, the Yale Center for British Arts web application that allows non-technical users to create linked data linkages in the data, and so on. Additionally, we're seeing increasingly performant graph databases that can host semantic data. They're able to operate efficiently over billions and billions of triples. The computational linguists and their colleagues in the digital humanities arena, they're developing natural language processing tools and entity extraction methods that'll help us deal with unstructured data resources when the time comes. We're seeing much needed standards such as the IIIF presented by Rob Sanderson and others, as well as a proliferation of general purpose linked data resources like schema.org and GeoNames and VIOF and so on. Additionally, the last few years in particular have seen the publication of an increasing amount of cultural heritage linked data. There's Europeana, obviously, the Getty Vocabularies, Yale Center for British Art, British Museum. Some of you may have seen Finland's Kultursampo, any number of Dutch museums, and many, many, many more. The key takeaway here being that we're not alone in this venture. There's quite a proliferation of folks getting into this game and doing it in interesting ways. And in particular, we're seeing creative advantage taken of linked data. A number of arenas, major funding organizations are taking an interest here, and they're funding endeavors like research space and conservation space. We're also starting to see interesting results out of linked and open data challenges like those that are popular in Europe these days, the Open Data Initiative, the Linked Up Project, and more. So with all that being said, we think that it's fair to state that the time is absolutely right to join this global effort in the implementation of linked data in the cultural heritage sphere. And we'll go one step further and posit that linked data has an absolutely long-term role to play in the context of cultural heritage. We're essentially proposing that all of us can be confident and even aspirational as we talk to other people in our institutions about linked data. It's here to stay. And to back up the claim, let's look at the recent history of data structure methods through the last couple of centuries. In the late 18th century, the French developed the card catalog, something we all became familiar with and became a world standard for organizing access to aggregations of information in libraries. It served us well for hundreds of years and provided consistent and useful access to large corpuses of information. International standards were developed around that effort and distributed globally. That provided a level of organization to materials that set a foundation for the modern age of computing, where we developed the capacity to create more sophisticated methods of modeling and storing and retrieving data. So the concept of the relational database came along, and cultural heritage followed suit by creating standards and protocols to leverage that. It allowed them a kind of fine-grained deconstruction of their data elements, and they could perform operations on the data in mathematical and other ways that were massively more convenient than the structures of a card catalog. So we add structure in math through the advent of relational data, but the age of the internet, and in particular the proliferation of the web, comes along, and it spurs demand for platform independence and for schemas of organizing data that are more easily customized and shared. So the idea of independence of data, the ability to structure it and transform it and share it more easily across platforms, and particularly on the web, becomes dominant, and schemes for doing that in cultural heritage grow. Dublin Core, Lido most recently, is growing in popularity, encoded archival descriptions, say for archives. But in the late 90s, Tim Berners-Lee, the perhaps you might call the father of the web, called for the creation of a semantic web, which in short is a transformation of the internet from a web of documents to a web of concepts. And the RDF standard answered that call by providing a capability to model the more expressive aspects of data at a conceptual level, and ultimately to more easily harmonize at scale these different disparate data sets through semantic statements or triples. And cultural heritage-specific ontologies were developed alongside, so we saw CDOC and BibFrame develop. So we can see that there's been a natural progression of improvement in service to the way people want to manage and use their data. And RDF adds a layer of expressiveness on top of that and becomes, in our terminology, a next-generation data structure and standard. Very exciting to be on the leading edge of this discovery of its potential in service to cultural heritage. But in no means do we mean to suggest that relational data or XML would ever be totally supplanted by RDF. Even in the long term, as we all know, video did not entirely kill the radio star. So we can expect to be integrating our linked data into our existing system architectures for the foreseeable future. And this is actually good news. With careful planning and execution, linked data can be made to play well and alongside our non-linked data resources. So what are our markers for ongoing success in the management of linked data? Well, we would suggest that it's the same as existing data management principles, that the fundamentals don't change. And when we look at these markers for success and focus on our goals, we're thinking about things like long-term commitment, avoiding one-offs, and making sure that whatever we build is accomplished with a long view in mind. We want to give ourselves the potential to operationalize whatever we build whenever possible. Of course, cultural institutions are the keepers in trust and in perpetuity of a significant portion of the world's cultural heritage, and with that responsibility comes institutional authority and imprimatur that is projected and extended whenever you publish your data and your interpretive materials out into the world. Additionally, we're always trying to find efficiencies wherever we can and understand the true cost-benefit relationship of our efforts so that we can match resources to requirements. We want to create better and more consolidated access to our resources, for example. We want to improve ability to use our data for mission-driven purposes and so on. We hear a lot over the last couple of years about breaking down silos and making sure that we can facilitate access to resources across different repositories. We're trying to ensure that underlying technologies are appropriately transparent to end users. We want to make sure that ease of use promotes adoption and use. And always keep in mind that change of any kind, doesn't matter what it is, whether it's to institutional priorities, technologies and systems, staffing roles and responsibilities. These things are always challenges to manage. And as we begin to shift from focus on goals to a focus on execution, those roles of technical program management or project management, product management, whatever you choose to call it, these are really important disciplines, and they're there to serve and manage the complexity and risk around projects like this one. And as always, we're building to last and building to grow. We're trying to set performance goals, measure our project progress against them, and then correct course as required as we go. And finally, do all of this in an iterative fashion. And so the full value proposition of linked data, it's in development. It's still undergoing a process of discovery and being leveraged for use by a community that's distributed across a global stage. And we're certain that the AAC will find itself contributing to this effort in some key areas. Certainly where use cases are concerned, we're very excited to kick off discovery in this arena with everybody in February. You know, the characteristics of linked data in terms of its structure and its potential for scaling to combine and include massively heterogeneous collections of information mean that the kinds of existing user interfaces and the user experience and design patterns for discovery and use of information are potentially inadequate. And we feel that to take full advantage of linked data's potential, we're going to need to adapt existing design patterns and likely create wholly original interfaces that are going to permit us ease of access and new patterns of use for users in a linked data context. And we'll be showing a couple of speculative examples later on in the presentation. As always, as you and others plan for deployment and use your linked data, you're going to be discovering benefits along the way that are driven by the very ways that you decide to model and deploy your data, whether you federate or aggregate access to it. So you're going to make discoveries along the way about your audiences and their needs, and that will reflect back into how we publish our data in ways that serve us both locally, but hopefully through the inherent power and capability of linked data also permit us to make those resources available and pay dividends on a larger stage. So to sum up this section on broad perspectives, we're convinced that this project is in the right place at the right time and prepared to contribute and provide a significant amount of leadership to cultural heritage. Now for a deeper dive into some practical considerations that frame institutional roles in a larger information ecosystem and that include linked data and outlines of the potential scope of options for publishing that data. Let's look first at a couple of different roles that the institution might find itself playing in the context of a linked data ecosystem. On the left here, we'll imagine your institution in yellow on the left and the wider world in white on the right. Our institutions are already producing data and distributing them in a variety of different ways, through websites and APIs, mobile applications, and more. But as we convert aspects of our data to linked data, we gain the ability to make it available to others in new ways and add value more broadly than just to the local institution itself. You're opening up opportunities to serve existing and potentially new relationships with other institutions, with other disciplines, different types of users, maybe even with industry, those outside of the domain of cultural heritage, anyone who sees potential value in the data that you're providing. And finally, aggregators are becoming increasingly interested in consuming this information. They bring it in and perhaps as a package of some sort and add it to create greater value to the critical mass of linked data that they're amassing themselves. So let's pivot and take a look at how your institution might perform as a consumer of linked data. We'll start here with the established combination of resources that you might be publishing to the usual endpoints. And add this notion that you might find that third parties are producing useful resources that might harmonize with and enhance your own data and add value. We've seen some examples called from the previous presentations. Instance data, archives of linked data, vocabularies like the Getty and such, will clearly be needed for us to complete the job of making our own linked data work for ourselves and others. And the improvement in quality and quantity and context of our own then enhanced data serves both internal needs, but also may stimulate external audiences to provide input back into the third-party source data that creates what you might call virtuous cycles of continuous growth and improvement of those third-party linked data resources. And the more you begin to manage and use linked data as publishers and consumers, you're likely to begin seeing value in the establishment of explicit or perhaps implicit collaborations with third parties around linked data. We already mentioned the notion of publishing to aggregators, but this opens up an additional avenue of conversation around how can we extend these collaborations to be bidirectional. One example we like to share is the BBC and Wikipedia. The BBC decided that it didn't need to manage definitive content on the descriptions of, let's say, animals, so they became Wikipedia editors of these records of, let's say, lions and tigers, and now they pulled back the crowdsourced entries describing these entities and bring them back into their own content management system as needed for use. Variation on that theme might include 2 or more academic research organizations that band together to create massive data for private use during a discovery or research phases of a collaborative project. And finally, one other variation here, there may be an institution that needs to manage a local vocabulary, and it has its limits in terms of their own needs, but they find that by drawing on the bits that are of interest to them from a larger, more publicly linked vocabulary, let's say one of the Getty vocabularies, they then bring that in and they might improve and possibly expand that collection of terms and then feed that back into the publicly available resource. And when scoping any new effort, your institutions are going to be thinking carefully about the potential effects that their efforts will have at multiple levels of engagement. With linked data, this is a particular relevant set of questions to be asking. By its very nature, the structure of linked data allows it to scale more readily than some other data management schemes. And so we might imagine that by building out linked data for local institutional purposes, you absolutely provide local value. There's no doubt about that. But you also put yourself in a position to harmonize that data with other institutional linked data and begin to provide a collective aggregated value at the scale of the entire domain of cultural heritage. And it's a short leap from there to a turn to assembling a critical mass of cultural heritage linked data that is harmonized with resources from other domains, and so on, such that the sum total becomes an increasingly valuable resource at web scale. The key takeaway here really is the idea that you can start your efforts locally, and by doing so, you're setting the stage for your ultimate participation at increasing levels of exposure and influence. An alternative way to visualize this effective scale relative to our strategic planning is as spheres of expanding influence and effect. So we might imagine the first small sphere being focused on the institution, where we're concerned with the creation and effective management and ultimate use of our own data. But as we expand outward into the sphere of influence across the boundary of institutional partnerships, we may actually focus on goals of sharing data seamlessly, of benefiting from economies of scale, of creating possible feedback loops that improve and expand our resources and capabilities in ways that we're not capable of accomplishing on our own. And finally, in the largest outer sphere, what we call the cultural ecosystem, we see the opportunity to reap the benefits of integration with broader humanities and other societal data. We achieve greater visibility at web scale, and we can make use of disparate data resources in more efficient ways. The key takeaway here being that each of these spheres has its own perspectives, its own priorities, its own expected results, but each layer informs and influences the other, sometimes by explicit intention, other times longitudinally and over time, and sometimes in ways that you maybe didn't expect or even initiate. One of the great tropes from the digital humanities is the story of how a stranger walked into your life one day and astounded you with how he or she uses your data. The takeaway being the most interesting or impactful use of your data and information might well come from outside your institution or even beyond the domain of cultural heritage. So we have the potential to consider a broad range of data resources as potentially in scope, you might say, for consideration. At a minimum, phase one of the AAC will see the partners mapping and converting data and publishing it in some forth, and including tombstone collection data in this effort. And as we get our feet wet with this and begin to document our requirements, expand our use cases, we may find ourselves considering how additional data resources might be useful to the effort. Other semi-structured and unstructured data elements might demonstrate value in generating what you might call a critical mass of linked data required to accomplish our goals. You may recall the results from the AAC participant survey, which demonstrated a couple of these items that were on everybody's mind. We had some suspicions that they might be useful, and we've pulled together a longer list of potential candidates that include things like provenance and exhibition information, media, and so on and so forth. Alongside all of this, there's the substantial list of attending technologies and tools that are required to accomplish broader goals like the incorporation of semi-structured data sources. Some of these will likely prove useful as part of our initial mapping efforts, and certainly in the long term. This list is by no means complete, and I won't trouble us with recitation here, but this is just a way to think about all of the additional technologies and services that we'll likely be considering as we move along. And so what are the benefits of inclusion these, what we might call not so structured resources? Well, first and foremost, you can leverage these things to enable a greater sort of structure and consistency in a broad range of these resources. You might expect to provide more ease of inspection and day-to-day management of these resources. You can help them conform to industry standards. For example, AAM has guidelines for structuring provenance data strings. And you might actually find yourself enhancing ease of reuse downstream in publishing efforts. You may be reducing editorial overhead, easing production workflows, or even easing the integration of this content into other content management systems. By normalizing entities and dates, you help develop and create and leverage standardized vocabularies, strengthening the way you're storing and making use of various entities. You can use these dates to perform calculations. These will permit deeper inspection of your data through informational visualization and graphs and maps and other ways. And finally, quite simply, you're adding depth to your linked data holdings. You'll be providing more resources ultimately that you can search across and use and publish to the world. So once we've begun producing linked data and relying on it for use in our daily efforts, how do we expect to manage the value of these initiatives? In other terms, what defines success in our use of linked data? We might find success in the context of our own use of that data, perhaps as a fundamental component in our institutional partnerships and our public programs. We may be asking how and for what purpose our third parties are using our linked data. What's the collective impact of our linked data efforts? Where can we look to identify this impact? This is just a starter list. We're going to discover more of these as the effort progresses. But we might start by thinking about what changes in data consumption and traffic are meaningful. What about the number and or character of users and partners that seems to be changing over time? Are we finding increased quality and flexibility in the use of our data? What are the kinds of questions with which we and our partners and our public audiences are interrogating our data? Are those questions changing? Are they expanding? Are they improving? Next, we'll tackle a few key issues around options for expressing your linked data at home and out in the wild. We know that a fundamental question for this project has been and remains one of which appropriate model or models for federating and or aggregating access to our linked data makes the most sense. We'll start by outlining sort of 4 broad categories of federated and aggregated access. We'll start with what we call real-time federation. The user might expect to search through some access interface, and the results are assembled essentially on the fly from multiple independent third-party sources. Harmonization in the federated model is going to be built into the search and retrieval layer. Another variation on the federation theme is what we call cached. Imagine a scenario where you may have a local resource that you want to federate access across several third-party resources, but either because of reasons of mission criticality, you need guaranteed availability, or you need to establish reliable performance, you might actually cache those third-party sources. And you're still federating search across them, even though they've been stored locally. But you're caching and refreshing them. Some of you may have noticed that earlier this week, for example, Europeana went down for about 10 hours. So you can imagine that in a mission-critical situation, a cached federated model might have circumvented that problem. So let's talk about aggregation. First example we call single point. You can imagine that you have 3 external resources that are pre-harmonized to a local aggregate, and the user accesses the information through that aggregate. A couple of considerations here. One is, are you tuning this aggregation and the harmonization that feeds it to particular aspects of use and notions of how broadly you can expect it to serve varying audiences and uses depending on how you've tuned that aggregation. And finally, a multi-point form of aggregation where the downstream effect of upstream aggregations has to be taken into consideration. You may only have control over your combination of sources that have already been pre-aggregated, and so knowledge and understanding and documentation of the rules and all the choices that were made that went into the harmonization of those pre-aggregated sources are important to consider. For example, how are information about rights and reproductions being aggregated upstream? Do they match what you expect when you're aggregating locally? Is disambiguation of entities being handled the same way upstream as locally? So we can't necessarily pick one of these just yet. We don't think that any one option is the obvious winner at this point. But we're pretty sure that your requirements are going to develop throughout the project, and the various options and the risks and the constraints that'll emerge will help you make a solid decision when the time comes. Now, there's a design-oriented challenge that we see arising amongst virtually everyone's efforts to use linked data at any meaningful scale. And that challenge is around the need to balance requirements for what we call completeness in data modeling with the expected usability and requirements of end users. And we'll describe that by taking a look at a Dutch painting here. This is A Scene on the Ice by Hendrik Aberkamp. And we have very good reasons for modeling this in very robust ways against the CDOC CRM. And for example, we might model the fact that this object has a concept, it carries a concept that refers to the act of skating. Additionally, we might want to model how this object was produced, and so we say it was produced by a production event which consists of these sub-production parts, which in turn express the fact that this work was carried out by an artist by the name of Avercamp. It was created roughly in the year 1625. It was painted, and it was created in a city called Amsterdam. Now, this is all very sensible and an appropriate level of modeling when you're using the CDOC CRM, but in some cases, and in particular when you're presenting this data and interfaces to users, we have this idea that we're going to have to be considering certain shortcuts that meet local needs and usability criteria. For example, a non-technical user may be thinking more in terms of making a direct connection between the fact that this work of art was created in Amsterdam and it happens to be about skating. We can help that person abstract away the layers of complex modeling and give them a meaningful connection that makes sense from their perspective. Another example might be the inferencing that we could create around the fact that Avercamp was working in Amsterdam at some point in his career. Which takes us to the topic of harmonization and inferencing itself. How can harmonization and inferencing support our efforts to combine our linked data with other linked data resources and expand our capabilities to search across larger graphs of facts and knowledge? We'll look at harmonization first. Facilitation of harmonization through the use of standards and best practices only gets one so far. There are going to be natural variations in the modeling and the vocabularies and the use of non-standard URIs from organization to organization. And so this means that we're obliged to harmonize in some way when we want to combine these disparate data sets. Lucky for us, it's an inherent strength of the linked data standard and the CDOC model that they provide capabilities in support of this effort. Some of you will know that the Mellon Foundation actually has recognized this as a challenge for cultural heritage at large, and they held a 2-day meeting with some experts that included some of our advisors to discuss the issue of how to begin planning to get ahead of this harmonization challenge. But imagine we have two collections of linked data out into the wild. The fact that artist A is the same entity across two museums can actually be very easily bridged by establishing a same as predicate between these two equivalent concepts. Now these two graphs are connected to one another, and from the perspective of an end user who might be accessing this data through some sort of a linked data virtual museum, the discovery of all three works attributed to that artist is transparent to them. He or she didn't need to search both museums' collections of linked data separately and sort out the fact that there might be variations in the way the name was spelled in order to get this complete list of works by a single artist. And finally, inferencing, which is a bit like the game of 6 degrees of separation. You can derive a connection between two disparate endpoints that aren't directly connected to one another. So I've modeled my data in a reasonable way. I say that the artist is the creator of an artwork and it was accessioned by a museum. But if I ask the question, what artists are collected by this museum, the good news is I didn't have to anticipate that question might be asked when I modeled the data. In fact, I can infer that and generate this fact of which artist was collected by this museum through the power of inferencing. So that's a short review of perspectives and considerations. And as a final act here, we want to present some examples and ideas of how we might use linked data. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dwayne, and he's going to take us through to the finish.
Great. Thanks, Neil. This last little section is really just to help start stirring the imagination and helping everyone just begin to think about the kinds of conversations that we're going to have when we all get together in just a few weeks' time. And so, we wanted to think a little bit about the kind of examples in various ways that help us think about what sort of things can we do with this, and what types of things would we want to explore. And so these sections, we're just going to give it a quick example or two around each of these sections. Keep it nice and simple. But so, for example, in the data creation and management area, Neil had mentioned previously the fact that there are going to need to be supplementing technologies that also help work not only with linked data, with mapping and conversion, but also potentially with working with broader data, unstructured data, or semi-structured data. So some of you may have seen at MCN some early work that's being done by the Carnegie Museum, and that was under an IMLS grant. They've started working with provenance data and building out an application that uses the AAM guidelines, takes in data that's structured along those guidelines, parses it out, and expands it out into a set of fields that make it easier for registrars to manage that data, provide different types of things. So we see here, for instance, each individual provenance statement or line has been sort of broken down and is illustrated on the left, and then available fields for any individual statement as it's parsed out are then on the right, and as the registrar then goes through and edits that material, things that are in red are things that the parser itself had some ambiguity in terms of what it was able to extract out in data terms, and then as that's edited by an individual, you'll see that that's able to be sort of re-represented, and the edited text is in green, and so it gives it a very quick and easy way for somebody who's actually editing data to see the effect of what they're editing and the machine processability and conformance and things like that in relation to it. So the idea is just create some aids for how people edit data. Another element of that was that it can be very difficult in particularly large provenance records of seeing ambiguities, gaps, issues that may be arising in some of the structure of the data. And so, for instance, here down in the lower right, there's a set of statements that doesn't quite anchor because there's obviously some issue somewhere with some of the dates, and so it's seeming out of line in relation to the timeline. And so the more we can introduce visualizations and other things, are not just for the end user discovery, but they're also very helpful in helping people understand and manage the data that they're working with. And finally, there's been a lot of conversation within the museum community generally about how to bring digital into the gallery experience and how to sort of use things in multiple ways. And so some of the things that they're beginning to experiment with and create ideas around are ways of potentially creating browsable information both for web and potentially in gallery around works, so you can see, not only its provenance, but potentially its exhibit history and everything else. And so these are just early examples that they're working with and trying out, and I think it's something to watch. And what we're hoping for is that we're going to be able to also show you some clickable examples of this sometime soon as well. It's very interesting work in that area. There's a little experiment that we did over a couple weeks last summer in order to try and help answer questions in our own mind and in others' minds about how do you browse around linked data, and particularly if you're responsible for maintaining linked data, how do you think through the way of looking at the data for quality control, for review, for answering particular questions about it, because these graphs get very large and very dense. And so we took off from the idea of the mind map and enhanced the mind map further by elaborating out both broader types of information, types of relationships, and types of data that is associated with some node, and also then the predicates that go with that. And so the idea is that you can sort of browse down through the directed graph of linked data, but you're doing so in a progressive way rather than a sort of all at once, see the whole hairball kind of way. And that was something that we were experimenting with, and we've been developing a bit further. It gets back to a point that Neil made about the need for more kinds of shortcuts and human readable traversing of data in order to be able to make these things more efficiently done. One of the other elements, you'll notice the cursor on at Rembrandt there, one of the other aspects was being able to flip your perspective, and so to be able to make a selection and have that selection then become the focal point so you can see the way different relationships establish themselves. You want to be able to control the views a bit, and so the idea of being able to filter the types of data and the types of relationships within the link model that you're looking for were something that we wanted to consider. And finally, you know, that different heterogeneous data sets coming from different places obviously have their own models and their own representations, and those things can be reflected. So as you focus on any individual thing, you will see the nature of the relationships that relate to it. So this is something that we did fairly quickly last summer. We've been kicking around ideas about what that means to apply that further, and just thought it was useful to think about what it means for reviewing and exploring graph data generally. Some of you will have seen, and probably most of you now will have seen some of the work being done at Cleveland Museum of Art, and the use of augmented reality to be able to pick things you like and move through the gallery and see that information. As we've done a number of little thought experiments, and one of the things that we think is interesting as you start adding linked data into the picture, and particularly with the AAC and the idea of a broader multi-institution federation, is to be able to take that and say, well, if I saw something in Cleveland that was of interest to me, and now I'm here in Washington, how can I carry that interest and that experience in with me? And so participating institutions, if I happen to be interested in an Henri Rousseau when I was in Cleveland, and now I'm in Washington, D.C., it may be very easy to find that material in the National Gallery of Art, for instance. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be by artist. It can also, for instance, be by subject or style, genre. There are various ways that I can take experiences from one place and use the various linked data attributes to help me bring that into another place and carry those experiences with me from place to place. It can go further, as we've talked about the broader idea of the cultural ecosystem. The cultural ecosystem can potentially stretch out to architecture linked data repositories and look at Beaux-Arts buildings that, so if I'm in this building, where else can I find things that help me explore the architecture of the area as well? And so we're able to cross different cultural domains and different data sets much more easily. So there was interesting work done in an information visualization program at MICA in Baltimore, which sparked us to another thought experiment around the idea of drawing in linked data. Somebody had done some visualization and analysis around sentiment analysis of Van Gogh letters, because all the letters are publicly available online, and so they did text extraction and sentiment analysis, and we thought, well, what would that be like if I were browsing that in an interface, and how could I actually get the sense of that in relation to the works themselves, and what would that tell me in an interpretive capacity? And it might not necessarily just have to be web-oriented. For instance, this could be something that could also be part of the in-gallery experience. So we see now a lot of videos and exploratory materials showing up within gallery, and we might want to think about how some of these richer information explorations could be brought into the gallery experience. As we cross domains, we wanted to also think about, for example, the range of uses that are happening for cultural data in education, and so the idea of putting ourselves in the shoes of a teacher who's preparing lesson plans and thinking about drawing on resources, for example, about Ben Franklin, and resources that may be available physically in the local institution or available in the local school district somewhere, and also the broader information out on the web, and how can we provide interfaces that help people reach into those data sets and navigate among those data sets in a way that just makes it more comfortable and easier for them to then use that material in other ways and draw on broader inspirations that they can gather. We also think it has an interesting perspective if we look sort of toward the broader social and cultural issues around us. So if we think of the Buddhas of Bamiyan and the destruction event that happened there, and you can imagine in the traditional mode of how things work, if an archaeologist has been exploring and working with that material, then through some grant or other, there may be iterations of a report that turn into a publication. But depending on the timing of that publication, if it's 18 months or 2 years down the line, may actually be after it's too late for others to know about it in relation to the event itself. And so we're seeing a lot of call now within the scientific community and more broadly to be modeling data and making data available at earliest possible times. So imagine that there's some cultural repository of linked data, and as those things through automated discovery or manual discovery of various ways may mean that early signals can be picked up by other people in other communities who can act on it in a timely manner. And so thinking about how we can learn things early and quickly through the machine processing of the linked data. Even after the fact, then, as different parts of the broader cultural community and the broader scientific community and social community are all working together and providing linked data more generally, then even after the fact, we're seeing additional scholarly work that can be drawn out when, in this particular case, the original artifacts may no longer be there, but the rich scholarly work can move forward from there. So these are just thought experiments, little ideas, just to help spark the conversation and discussion as we think about coming together in person over the next few weeks. And so going forward in the conversation, just to sort of summarize where I think a lot of our conversations are going to be, is you are going to, with your institution, be communicating the value of linked data back into your own institutions, but also with each other and with other people in your among your peers and across communities. We want to, as the AAC work goes forward, to really consider other parallel activities. There's a lot of work going on, as Neil mentioned at the beginning. This is really a global community that's picking up speed at a rapid pace, and we're part of that effort, and able to then come out of this work and out of these discussions sharing the knowledge, experience, and the needs that we're discovering as we go along.